Hello, I'm Gavin Thomas, an Associate of Cityforum, and welcome to Cityforum's podcast, Rethinking Policing in the Light of Covid-19. What do we mean by the new normal? What impact will this have on policing and crime? How should we prepare ourselves? To help ourselves with these questions, we have a panel, Mr. Martin Hewitt, Chair of the National Police Chiefs Council, Ms. Karyn McCluskey, Chief Executive, Community Justice Scotland, and Mr. David Finlay, Associate of Cityforum, formerly Director at the National Audit Office PFI, member of the Regional Board for NHS Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Clinical Commissioning Group. So to start us off, I'll invite Martin Hewitt, Chair of the NPCC, to make a few comments for the first 5 minutes, and then we'll open up the discussion. Martin, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Gavin. So I think it's fair to say that COVID crisis has moved through its various phases, and we are still in phases of that crisis, has challenged policing in a number of ways. And I thought I'd just reflect a little bit on what I think those have been, and they feed into our subjects. So the first one is the way that we operate. The second area, I think, is about the environment in which we are operating. And then thirdly, I think it's over time, it's shifted the threat, harm and risk that we are facing as a service. So if I start with how we've operated, I mean, some really obvious points around our ways of working, the fact that we're all sat remotely doing this, some really significant issues for us throughout the process, trying to coordinate it across the UK around officer well-being and the kind of challenges we had around PPE equipment at early stages. But what it's also done in terms of the way we operate is put enormous pressure on our ability to operate in partnership and working with both government at a local and a national level, working within the local resilience forums that we are all part of. And I think it's also fundamentally altered our relationship with the public. And certainly one of the things that I was really focused on as we entered into the restriction stage of the pandemic was really how we didn't impact on that relationship that we have with the public. And I think we will talk about that no doubt later, particularly in relation to those who come from minority groups. And we started early on to try and create a set of principles about how would policing respond to what is essentially a medical and economic crisis, but with obviously a very significant role for the police to play. So how's the environment in which we're operating changed? Well, I think this is a unique crisis in the sense, in most of these issues that we deal with, it generally is quite geographically bounded. Generally speaking, you can see how long it's likely to last, if you think of floods, for example, and it will bring into play a number of government departments. This situation is everywhere. There is literally no part of the UK that isn't affected by this. We don't know when it's going to finish and when it's going to move through the various phases in terms of impacting, and it has engaged every single part of government. And I think that's created some real challenges in terms of how we manage that political environment locally, nationally, across the 4 nations has been a real factor from a policing point of view, where we have, after a short period of time, ended up with different regulations in different parts of the UK. We've also had to adapt to rapidly changing legislation with a focus continually from the government around enforcement, and often that being around the policing side of things. So that's been a very different environment for us to operate in. Throughout that, we've still been trying to bring in the officers in England and Wales, certainly for the 20,000 uplift. So that we've had to alter almost everything that we've been doing around that to maintain that going on. And then our environment changed again when, in the midst of the pandemic, the Black Lives Matter protests began as a result of the killing of George Floyd. And that created for us what I kind of regarded as a real dilemma of harms in terms of how we were trying to police, still try and police COVID, but at the same time policing protest and sometimes violent protest really challenged our way of operating. And again, very much into that arena that we want to talk about around, particularly with minority communities. And we've also gone through this phase of the setup, into a full lockdown pretty much across the UK, into the period where we were the government was easing various restrictions in various places. And now we're very firmly into the arena of local lockdowns, which are obviously creating quite considerable challenges for policing in terms of how you manage that and again, manage those community relations. And then lastly, what we've seen over the time, and our environment has changed around public tolerance and frustration as the process has worked through, and the pandemic has impacted on their lives, and then the role that policing plays into that. And then my last area really is about the shifting threat, harm and risk. And again, that has changed through the phases of the pandemic. And I think there's a really interesting question around whether many of those changes are long-term changes or were they simply short-term changes that manifested at the points where we were in lockdown. And I think there is a lot of work going on to really understand the reality of what has happened to hidden crimes, to vulnerability. I think there's been a lot of noise around that. There's been a lot of talk around that. And it's interesting when you start looking at the stats as to what we think that actually has done particularly during the period of the lockdown, which no doubt we will speak about. The reality for where policing is right now is that demand and crime levels are now largely back to where they were pre-COVID, and in some cases have actually increased. So real challenges into the service around that. I've got very particular concerns around the criminal justice system, around the recovery phase, which we're in now, and dealing with what seems to be called the backlog, but then also into where do we go reform-wise out of the other side of this. And no doubt we will talk a bit more about where we are with the criminal justice system. But the lockdown in crime terms did actually provide us with some really good proactive opportunities. And we took those opportunities because we had high levels of resource. We had very limited absence during the whole of the lockdown period. We obviously weren't doing non-mandatory training, so we've had good resource levels, and we've really been able to have an impact around some particular crime type areas. But that, of course, is now shifting as normal demand has come in. So I suppose to conclude, really, it's the kind of so what question for me is, what do we do now, and how do we make the recovery and the reform programme work to make sure that we really understand the learning that we can take from what's happened in the pandemic, but then also what do we need to change and how do we change our practices? Because I think it will be a massively missed opportunity if we were to just roll back to where we were, attempt to get back to doing what we were doing previously. We are at the point where COVID now meets a spending review process. For a period, we thought the government were going to do a rollover. They've now determined to do a very swift 3-year spending process, or 3-year and 4-year for capital. And that's going to be going into an incredibly tight economic situation with all the costs that COVID has brought. So I think some real concerns and pressures about what that might mean for policing as we go forward and carry on. And of course, I think the period we are now in, taking ourselves through to the end of the year, there are some real pressures that are coming. So you're going to have those general post-COVID issues as we're into local lockdowns, as I think some discontent starts to manifest itself among the public about the way that it's impacted on their lives. We are going to be, to one extent or another, into some form of recession, but certainly in this instance, a recession I think that will include unemployment in a way that we've not seen unemployment previously. So that all leads to and adds to further, I think, potential discontent. All of the issues around race and Black Lives Matter and those kind of issues will continue. The recent issues again in the States with the shooting in Wisconsin reignites that. And then lastly, of course, the thing that we were speaking all about before COVID and died away a little bit, we've got EU exit at the end of the year. So I anticipate fairly clearly that is not only going to have an impact on the environment entirely as we speak, as it would do, but also I think you are going to be in the situation where we'll start seeing, from policing point of view, quite a bit of protest demonstration activity going on, either pro or anti, as we move towards the end of the year. And undoubtedly environmentalists coming out as well. So a really busy period for policing on the back of a period of extreme change in terms of what we've had to do and the environment that we've had to do it in. So I think almost the busiest period for policing as far as the pandemic is concerned is coming rather than actually past us. I think we are passing the medical stage, we are in the economic stage, and from a policing point of view, I think that's going to get increasingly busy for us over the next 6 months.
That's really helpful, Martin, and you covered a lot in that short period of time. Karyn, I'd invite you to respond, if you could, with some thoughts on that. Interested particularly in terms of the remarks Martin made about the vulnerable people in the community, the hidden crime, and how relationships between policing and minority communities can be developed and improved in the challenging times which we're facing.
Yeah, well, I found myself nodding so much when Martin was speaking.
Yes.
It's so interesting, and I know that Martin obviously covers England and Wales, and I'm sat up here in Scotland, but, the issues of domestic abuse have become ever more apparent. And, and for us, particularly in Scotland, we've got a huge issue with drug deaths, some of the highest in the world, and there's been a changing drug market because, COVID-19 interrupted drug supplies, and so therefore we had different uses of different drugs. We had challenges around cuckooing, but we also had some good things, and I think it's often we housed homeless people. We gave people a place to live. And so in terms of vulnerability, I volunteer in homelessness, and, for people to have a safe place to stay, with a bathroom and food and other services around them, will have transformed lives. So all the things that we said we couldn't do before, isn't it interesting? Just when we can actually remove some of the barriers, that we can make people's lives better. But Martin also touched on the austerity, and I was reflecting the other day there when I was in the high street that the jobs that are going will often affect women, and particularly part-time women, because the high street is going. And so the opportunities for many women, often who may be in very vulnerable conditions, will be less and less. And so the house becomes less of a safe haven, if it ever was. And, the challenges are going to change and manifest and actually become more complex. And yet I have had lots and lots of contact with community police officers. I've always said that great community policing is as close to being magic without being magic. Really investing in community policing, keeping them in place for a long time so they build relationships, know their area, know their people, know the complexity, able to problem solve, will become more important now. And I don't think this is over. I think we will be going into a second wave and a third wave. And the challenge for policing, and policing a public health, challenge, is increasingly complex.
Karyn, Martin made a comment around the criminal justice system, which has been, certainly in England and Wales, been through a huge change and reform, and I put that in sort of question marks there, certainly over the last decade. What's your thoughts in terms of, from the experience in Scotland, of how the criminal justice system is being seen to be done and has that level of confidence within communities?
Well, let's stop calling it a system. It's more like a handoff, and not a very good one, between areas from policing to, we obviously have the procurator fiscal system up here, to the courts. And it has laid open some massive chasms. So we have similar challenges. It will probably take us 10 years to get through the backlog unless we do something very differently. The opportunities to divert people much earlier on, and using colleagues in the police, because and I don't know what the terminology is, to divert people when points of arrest into services around drugs and trauma and all the things that we know keep people in the system, I think are going to become ever more important. And the ask of policing will be to divert in a different way and to prevent in a different way. But for us, our prison population is expanding. We have a huge remand population. Our inability to get through cases is impacting on victims, witnesses, and just the inability of us to change things, or understanding that when we do change things, the justice system, and I'm using that euphemistically, is so finely tuned that if you move one thing, something else, you get the law of unintended consequences. So virtual courts, but there's a whole challenge around how we get very vulnerable people into virtual courts. Are they able to interpret it, understand it? Is justice being applied in a way that people are able to experience it appropriately? Can they understand? Because we have lots of people with learning difficulties, lots of really complex needs, and sometimes a virtual model does not always work. And we are right in the midst of it now. And in truth, we need to reimagine. Martin touched on, the reform and transform. But we need the time to reimagine what else this could look like. This has to be a zeitgeist for us. We cannot go back to the way it was. And yet for us to do that, the status quo will need to change, and we will need to be quite bold and quite brave and bring everybody in to try and, almost redesign something that works for victims, also works for the accused and delivers justice more swiftly and more visibly than it has been previously.
I'd just like to bring David in at this point. David, I'd just like to have a few words from you from obviously your experience with the NAO in terms of infrastructure and your thoughts in terms of where you see the challenges are going to be, as Martin alluded to, of most likely another period of austerity for public finances. Your thoughts, please.
I think it's worthwhile just at the very beginning to remind ourselves of the huge challenges which the government faces with the economy at the moment. So we've seen this period of enormous government support to businesses and individuals, which has produced a situation where the forecast for the current year is about a £300 billion deficit, which is a huge deficit, much higher than we've ever experienced before. So at some stage, that is going to have to be dealt with, but it's not absolutely clear at the moment when and how the government will deal with that huge deficit. They've got the additional challenge, of course, that although much of that money was going into helping the economy is still suffering a great shock from the lockdown. So the gross domestic product fell by 20% in the quarter to June and is still forecast, despite some signs of recovery, still forecast to fall by 9.5% for the full year. And we look as if we're going to experience quite high unemployment. We have the daily news of job losses with John Lewis, M&S, Debenhams, Pizza Express, other restaurants and the travel sector. So big challenges for the government about how to try and keep the economy going and at the same time try and claw back some of this huge deficit which has already been racked up. And I think this is a huge challenge for the government, and I don't think we know precisely at the moment how they are going to go about that, particularly when and how they may go about clawing back the deficit. Martin has mentioned that the police authorities are going into a sort of spending review period. Martin may be able to tell us in a moment whether they've been given any specific instructions about assumptions to make in spending for the next few years. But my general feeling is that we know that the government will have to deal with the deficit, but we don't know precisely how it's going to do that. And so that leads me personally to three conclusions. The first is that we're dealing with a period of uncertainty about exactly what impact there will be on public spending, both revenue spending and capital spending. Clearly, when you claw back a deficit, you can only do that through increasing tax, which you've got to find people who can afford to pay more taxes at the current time. That's difficult. Or you reduce public spending. And of course, that wouldn't be popular either, because the public services are facing increased challenges at the moment. And they had the previous round of spending cuts after the banking crisis. And in policing, we know that the government gave a signal at the beginning of 2020 that they were prepared to put more money into policing to increase the number of officers. So it would be unpopular to go back on that sort of commitment. So my three conclusions are great uncertainty about how precisely the government is going to deal with these economic challenges. That leads me to a second conclusion, which is that where you're dealing with uncertainty, I think it's really valuable to do scenario planning, to think about possible ways the government might react to the current economic situation, and think through how you would deal with each of those scenarios, because that means that if the government then becomes clear on how they're going to deal with the economy, you have already begun to think through these different scenarios and may have a plan for the particular scenario which actually emerges. And thirdly, and these are lessons which the National Audit Office identified from the period of austerity after the banking crisis, I think it is sensible, whichever scenario emerges, I think it is sensible to carry out a line-by-line review of spending at the moment, so that you're prepared for these scenarios that might emerge. And when I say line-by-line, some of the things to look for are there areas of spending which don't generate a lot of benefits for the amount of money being spent, because those are always the areas to think about if you do have to reduce expenditure. Low benefits for high expenditure. Secondly, can we be more productive in using the money that we are using? So can we find ways of being even more productive? And thirdly, think about some of these areas where our ways of working may change because of the current situation. So, I do a lot of work with the NHS at the moment, and people are thinking about buildings. Do we need all the buildings that we've used previously if a significant number of staff can work from home? The office that I work with in the NHS is now planning to move to a smaller office. So that needs thinking about. Do our new ways of working suggest that we should be using money in a different way than previously? So those were my three conclusions. Uncertainty, worth doing scenario planning until we know for certain what the government expects of us in public services in the future, and do a line-by-line review of current expenditure.
Thank you, David. I'd like to bring Martin in at this point. Martin, in terms of the funding issue, I mean, I was in the service long enough to see this in various iterations over the decades. And so, policing's always, I suppose, in my view, struggled to be able to put across its case in a very cogent way. And I think the last time really policing experienced a sort of real influx was in the 80s when I was a young officer, when there was high unemployment and unrest, which is what you depicted in your opening remarks. And I'm interested in terms of the big opportunity, the learning. How do we capture that productively for policing going forward?
So we've got a programme of work, as you would imagine, which is all about picking up exactly what the learning is, and how we can be, as David has just said, be more efficient and more productive. Because I think we've learnt some real lessons, things that we would have before the crisis said were impossible to operate in a particular way. We have done that, so there is a real learning there. But picking up the point about the spending review, the commitment there for the 20,000 extra officers in England and Wales, I do not think will be affected by this. I think the government will stick to that commitment. But of course, what that will become is the lion's share of the money that comes into policing through the spending review period. And so what we're having to think about and work through is, how do you then deal with all the other cost pressures that you've got within the service when you're not able to impact on officer numbers? Because clearly there will be a target, and I have absolutely no belief that this will change, that by the time we get to the end of March in 2023, the government expectation will be there'll be 20,000 additional officers than there were at the beginning. So it's then looking at, and exactly as has just been said, looking at things like estate. But one of the big elements that we will be pushing into the spending review process is to really make sure that we secure the baseline costs we will need for the 3 years going forward, because there are a number of significant pressures the COVID crisis has put pressures into the revenue and the precept that is being collected locally, which comes to fund policing. It will put pressure onto the tax base going forward. There are the pre-existing pension pressures that you have. There are a number of quite significant national IT programs that should potentially during that period of time come to fruition, and therefore the costs are no longer program costs and become revenue costs for the organisations as they're running those services. So we've got a bit of work going on to put all of that together so that forms a key part of the submission, hopefully, that the Home Office put in terms of police funding. But what we've got to be doing in parallel is working up what does efficiency and productivity measures look like. And I think it's absolutely legitimate that we have to demonstrate those. But there's a lot of learning out of COVID in terms of our ways of operating, in terms of how we can better operate in partnership with others, and particularly around technology. I think what COVID has demonstrated is the ability for technology to make us much more efficient and effective, not only internally, but also in the way that the public accesses our services. I think COVID has pushed people into a more online way of accessing our services at times. So there's lots there, and we've got a programme of work that's pulling all of that together. So seeing what is happening in individual forces, because every force is looking at its own learning and experiences, and then bringing that together at a national level and linking then not only into what's going on within government, but also we're working with a whole range of external providers, because there are a range of academic institutions that are looking at these issues, particularly related to policing. There are a number of the various kind of consultancy organisations, the think tanks. So working with all of those groups and trying to bring that together into a process that is looking at what we have been through or what we are going through tell us about the way we can operate in the future? What does it tell us about the environment in which we are going to be operating? And what has it taught us about, what have we learnt from our experience, around crime, around criminal justice? Because I think particularly criminal justice, if you talk about efficiency and public perceptions and public confidence in the system, that's an absolutely critical area for me. Because the COVID crisis would have knocked anybody's criminal justice system sideways and given you a significant backlog to deal with in the way that's already been described. But our system was not purring along efficiently before we got hit by COVID. And as Karyn said earlier, again, I'm not sure I would necessarily describe it as a system. It's a number of parts that come together, and there are some touch points or handoffs, whichever way you want to describe them. And to be fair, there was a lot of work going on through the National Criminal Justice Board. I think that group was re-energised about trying to identify how we can make this end-to-end process, firstly, as good a process as it can be for victims, witnesses and those that are accused, but also make it as efficient as it can be. And I think what we've learned through trying to cope through COVID has pushed us much more into some of the technological opportunities around video-enabled justice. But I think it needs for us to really take a hard look. Yes, we have to do the work now to overcome the backlog, and the backlog is significant in pretty much every force area in the United Kingdom. We need to overcome the backlog, but what we mustn't do is see that as a process that then leads us to go back to where we were. This has got to be a point in time where we say there are better ways that we can do this. But that is a very complex thing to do when you have all the players that constitute the criminal justice system, and trying to get them all aligned around, for me, what has to be, this is about how the credibility of the rule of law, the credibility of the system, and how it feels to be a victim, a witness, or an accused. And so there's a massive piece of work that has to sit along the side. But again, under the pressure of limited money for investment. So that takes you back to that point about really driving those ways that we can become more efficient as well as more effective.
Thank you, Martin. I just wanted to, in the last 5 minutes, just bring everybody back in. But at one point, Karyn, I wanted you to just probably give your thoughts on. Martin mentioned at the start on the pressures on partnership working, local government infrastructure, which is absolutely integral to how we meet the needs of the vulnerable in our communities, and the relationships within communities. What's your experience in Scotland? Has that brought pressure in terms of during the COVID period?
Some of it has been amazing. I mean, honestly amazing. I think the sharing of data, the wraparound, the understanding, and we talk about a well-being economy. What people think it really matters. I've seen the public change around things, issues around addiction, about supporting people in addiction. It has been really quite enlightening in many ways, despite the terrible destruction that Covid-19 has wrought. But I think that we are all coming to the realisation that the way it was will require we're going to need to speak the uncomfortable truths amongst friends about whether it really worked for the people we served. We have set up systems that work for us as public servants, but don't really work for the people that actually we're meant to be serving. And that should, you'll have 8 people going in to try and deliver one service to people's houses. And now what we've got is almost a peripatetic service delivery. You might have one person that's a key contact that talks about housing and drugs and parenting, and makes that link to policing. And I find that endlessly quite exciting and innovating, and we're starting to have conversations with each other about what this could look like in the future, and a new social contract, which I think is the most important thing about what is it we want policing to do, what is it we want other services to do, because I think Martin touched on it. It's not just what's happening now, but we know our mental health problems are going to be worse. We know unemployment is going to be worse. There will be evictions, there will be bankruptcies. And at the end of the day, I've always seen policing have to pick up some, the broken people that end up, in really difficult situations. So there is a lot of money in public services. And sometimes I dislike that we talk about money first as opposed to what is the outcome that we want. Because you design a different system when you start to talk about money first. That's always the way. And so we're starting to have different conversations up about what's going to look like in Scotland in 2025 and 2030. But we're small, there's only 5 and a bit million of us. In many ways, it's easier to have those conversations. For colleagues in England and Wales, that's immensely difficult.
Thank you, Karyn. David, just let me bring you in very quickly before I hand over lastly to Martin. Out of those 3 points that you raised in terms of the funding, which one would you say would be the most prominent you would want to emphasise in this conversation?
Well, I think eventually it is this line-by-line review of expenditure, for all the reasons that Martin touched on a moment ago. The government is going to expect some greater efficiency one way or another. We don't know precisely what they're going to ask for, but they will eventually need to claw back the deficit. So it does make sense to carry out a line-by-line review of expenditure, looking for things which aren't delivering high benefits, looking for where we can be more productive, and looking for where we can work in different ways. For example, the use of estates. We may not need as much property as we did in the past if people can work at home. I work, as part of my work, on the regional board of the NHS in the area around Cambridge. And what they have all said is that the huge pressures of the pandemic have caused them to think of ways of working which they would have only got around to in the next 3 or 4 years. But they've been forced to think about new ways of working now and in the next few months. And I think that is a very valuable lesson to all of us in public service.
I agree. And I'd just like to bring Martin in the last point, because that last point you made there, David, crisis historically, if you look back, always accelerates innovation, thinking, new ideas, sometimes things which were going to be slower burning into a quicker means of delivery. I think the thing from this conversation that's come out for me loud and clear, not only the funding, but the point, Martin, you emphasised around the criminal justice system, and Karyn, your point, which I thought was very good, was not necessarily focused on the funding, but the desired outcome we want for the people who are living in our communities, the most vulnerable, who are going to be experiencing, sadly, some real poor experiences as a result of COVID. Martin, can I invite you to say a last few words before we sort of wind this up?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I would echo all of those points, the description there of the NHS in Cambridge is, I think, absolutely true of policing. Things that would have been almost unattainably complex to deliver or even agree before we even got to deliver, happened because of the impetus or the imperative of the pandemic. And I think there's something for me about how do you retain some of that? How do we make that? We can't working in kind of crisis mode all the time, but there is probably a happy place somewhere between crisis mode and where we would ordinarily have been that allows us to move things forward and overcomes some of the existing rivalries and territory defending and all the stuff that goes on. Because as has been said, and Karyn described in Scotland, and I would say that's true here as well, the way that the public sector and then the public and, quite frankly, on occasion, private sector organisations have come together to deliver an outcome for people has been really inspiring in a lot of places. And for me, what it's forced us to do is to really focus on the outcome for the public. And that's really where we should be all the time. But that can occasionally get kind of lost in all the complexity and the politics of it all. So there's something really big there for me. There's something for me that says we can't, and I know I've said it a few times, but it's really important to me that what we don't do is aspire to recover and then we just go back to where we were. We've got to see this, horrific as it is, and all the families that have been impacted negatively, but we've got to see it as an opportunity, as a service, as a public service, as a country, to actually do things better than we were doing them previously. And the example of the homeless one is a great example, isn't it? Amazing what we were able to do to what was previously seen as an almost insurmountable problem. And just listening to some of the commentary from both police officers that I've heard talking about it who've routinely worked with homeless and then the homeless people themselves. Now, of course, there can't be a way to afford hotels all the time for people that are homeless, but what it must do surely is ask us to take a look and do that line by line exercise that David describes to really see where's the worth that's coming out of all these things we're spending on. And the one thing I do think this government are very, very focused on and very focused on in policing is they want to see the outcome. What is the outcome? What is the impact, the effect, whatever you want to call it? That's what they're focused on around the spend. And I think that's exactly the right discipline we should have. And hopefully we will have learned a lot through this crisis that can allow us to better actually focus ourselves into that place. Because, and again, and I know I've gone on about the criminal justice system, but could we honestly put our hands on our heart and say that the criminal justice system we have now is entirely victim focused? Because I suspect for some of the victims and some of the people that turn up as witnesses, and definitely for a lot of the police officers and probably for some of the defendants, it doesn't kind of feel like a system that's focused around them. And I think if we can take some of that out of this, that would be a really positive place for us to be.
Thank you, Martin. I don't think we can ask for a better way of wrapping up what's been a fascinating conversation over the last 40 minutes or so. We've touched upon 4 really big areas. I'd just like to conclude by thanking you each for your contribution on behalf of Cityforum. Just to round off that conversation, I'd just like to bring in Phil Borch from BT, who's the Technical Director for Private and Public Sectors. Phil, it would be really great if you could perhaps give some of your perceptions or insights, particularly around the conversation that took place around COVID and the underlying landscape and whatever we're calling potentially the new norm. Your thoughts, please.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Gavin. And thank you for having me. I guess we've seen a massive cultural experiment with COVID, actually, and the adoption of technology in new ways. Much of that technology has actually been around for some time. It's interesting, actually, it's the cultural aspects, the culture change that's driven the adoption of that. I think from my perspective, and if I talk of BT and Cisco in terms of what we've seen in the market over the last few months as a result of COVID, there's been several kind of key notable things. I think we've seen organisations take more risk. I think we've seen them have a desire to move faster, with a stronger desire to innovate. They've certainly sought to be more resilient. I think many people have the assumption that this could happen again, and therefore, it's shifted some of the business models quite significantly. I also think it's really driven the question around office versus digital collaboration. We can come back to that in a minute, but that's been ongoing for some time, and COVID has absolutely brought that to the front of everyone's focus. I think the other really big thing for me, though, is this move away from sort of tech silos to outcome-based solutions. So I think, and we've seen probably the tops of organisations, the senior parts of organisations steer that rather than their IT or their procurement organisations. So loads of changes have been accelerated.
You mentioned there about the office space versus the digital collaboration and how that's changing. And there's a truism, which is what you said about the fact that when there's a catastrophe such as this, innovation accelerates, even revolutionary change accelerates. What's your thoughts in terms of that specific one around where people work and how work might change?
I think ultimately, I've seen over many, many, many years, Gavin, a whole host of IT transformations, technology transformations, digital transformations, and the thing that's always got in the way of success is cultural adoption. It's it's thinking about how people will work and how people want to work. I think what we've seen with COVID are two probably things that have come together. One is that organisations have needed to have flexibility in remote working to function, to actually operate, to actually be open for business. And that's been mixed with what was already a strong cultural shift, particularly in elements of the workforce around flexibility. I think one thing I would say from a technology perspective is much more excitement, so I call it that, Gavin, in relation to immersive technologies. So clearly, I think people being stuck on video calls on laptops and mobiles all day has been challenging. And I think, again, that's been challenging, a realization for many people who've not been used to that. So there is a desire, I think, if there was a second scenario, if this happened again, is there a more immersive engagement so you can feel like you're really with people? And clearly some of the technologies that we're now testing clearly would enable that. So, plenty of opportunity for the technology to adapt and evolve, but ultimately it's as it always is with technology, it's about the people, and it's about the culture, and it's about the outcomes that an organisation is trying to achieve.
Do you see that technology continuing to develop and get better and more proficient?
Yeah, definitely. I think the reality is, if you look at the internet and the people's need to be connected to the internet over the course of a number of years now has become essential to them living, not just working but living, and children doing their homework and people living at home and socially interacting and ordering their shopping and now even watching TV. I think we're seeing collaboration capability go through that same kind of structural bit of the curve, I would call it. It's becoming much more important for organisations now to have their people connected in a way that's immersive, in a way that's real time. I think that the challenge is to mix that with data and insight. I think if I look at something like the role the police have in events and emergencies and in collaboration engagement with other departments of health, local authority, transport. So it's no longer just about a single organisation. It's about actually how they engage and share data and collaborate. That mixed with this ongoing undertone of place and people-based services, I think we're seeing particularly with the devolved nations, areas of regional strength where a place is saying, we need digital transformation to solve some of our really big challenges. And that means that all of the private and public sector organisations need to really work together now.
You've just touched upon that conundrum of data. And one of those integral factors in that challenge is the ability across various partnerships to share data. What's your thoughts in terms of that? Is that just merely a cultural blocker, or are there other inhibitors which still cause issues around how effectively in the 21st century public services can share data to basically protect the vulnerable in our society?
Again, I think cultural aspect is a key part of it. I think if I look at the willingness for individuals to share information and be comfortable that information is going to be used appropriately and in the right way. Having said that, huge amounts of individuals share data all the time, and are quite willing to do that if it provides them some upside. If they get better services, they get, better outcomes. I think the challenge is taking that maybe from, very, very corporate, very silo perspective around individual organisations to a cross-departmental set of outcomes is challenging. I think it's challenging because you're then at a different level of sort of trust with, a citizen and the government. And I think, the government, very much then has to drive, a set of data standards to allow organisations to share and interface their data in a way that's probably not relevant now. And I think I see huge focus on moving to the cloud as a digital strategy. I see huge focus on connectivity around things like fibre and mobile. Actually, the one where we're probably really missing in the UK, Gavin, is around data, the sharing of data, digital, ultimately, digital transformation, digital enablement is about insight. It's about being able to act on insight, whether that's around an individual or whether that's around a thing. It challenges things like identity. It challenges things like presence, where everything is, where everybody is. And that's essential for protecting people who are vulnerable, but it's also essential for providing high quality integrated services and indeed value added services. If you look at integrated service in government or the commercial opportunities around even local authorities actually maximising and leveraging income from data. So I think it's a challenging space, and I think it's probably the one that really needs probably the focus. I would see organisations like the police forces across the UK, as well as some other key organisations, actually being possibly the spearhead of that, because actually, it's the services that those organisations potentially provide, in an emergency or in protecting the vulnerable, that could transform some of that cultural outlook. Almost kind of like what's the COVID shift that would make us look at data in a different way and sharing our data in a different way, so that we got really great services and really joined up public and private sector services.
What do you think is missing, or if it is missing, in terms of how we can inject that sense of innovation and pace, which is prevalent within the private sector, into the public sector?
The compelling thing that drives organisations to innovate ultimately is pressure. It's the state of the market or the environment that they operate in. We've seen that with COVID. When you're faced with a really massive challenge, you have to be innovative, you have to move quickly, you have to take more risk, you have to be more outcome based and a bit more progressive in the way you're thinking. And that's true for sectors actually traditionally that have quite low margins, like retail, are incredibly innovative, because if they don't innovate, they don't survive. So whereas other areas possibly even in the private sector, are probably slower than some areas of public sector. So my guidance for this is really, it's not about creating a panic, but I think it's creating a sense of what needs to change quickly, and where the areas of concern are an organisation not for its survival in the public sector, because clearly that's not so relevant, but certainly around the really big challenge we've got. And I would say, if you look at things like climate change, you look at things like social mobility, you look at things like transport, things like air quality. These are pretty big problems for most places now, and I think that most citizens have got to the stage where they're unconvinced that the old way of solving those problems is going to solve them in the future. So and I've seen particularly some of the devolved regions and some other particularly regions that have got together to try and tackle these bigger outcomes, have really driven a much faster pace of innovation even than some of the private sector have, and we're trialling with a number of places at the moment, driven from the public sector first, actually, but with private sector involvement too, because actually they've got some really big challenges they need to solve, and they're not going to solve them by just putting in some technology. They need to solve them by being innovative, working as an ecosystem, really driving and looking for a set of outcome-based services that will transform the way they do education, or will transform the way people move around a place, or will transform the way that people will be able to communicate and engage and collaborate, particularly to drive and improve resilience in an organisation. So, for me, it's, if you do what you always used to do, which was go out and procure the same old technology slightly cheaper, then you're not going to innovate. But if you're really trying to solve poverty in a city, or social inclusion, or education, or how you transform the way transport works in a city, then you need to be innovative, don't you?
Out of what we talked about, what would be your key takeaway from the experience we've all been through with the pandemic, and which was going to be something that's going to be a continual change or innovator for us way beyond when pandemic becomes a dark memory?
The big one for me is, will we see ongoing endurance, kind of outcome-based culture where organisations seek to deliver outcomes rather than solutions? Think about culture. It's not about the technology. It never has been about the technology. It's about culture. It's about what you're trying to achieve. What do you want to achieve as an organisation? And what culture are you trying to drive as an organisation, and what culture are you trying to challenge in terms of the way it's always been? Because if you just look at the technology and you start with the technology, you just do what you've always done. It's as simple as that. So that'll be the thing, and I'd hope that I've seen massive evidence of that, Gavin, in terms of organisations thinking differently. My worry is, as we come out of what has been the massive global experiment, what that means. Notwithstanding, obviously, there's been huge negative consequences, but it would be good if we came out of it with organisations better lined up to actually focus on solving some of the bigger, broader challenges.
Look, Phil, thank you for your insights in this, and again, just like to pass my thanks on behalf of Cityforum to BT Cisco for your support in this podcast. Thank you very much.